Hello everyone, welcome to Red Talk AU series webinar. This is Mabel Gu from Leader Associates, the organizing committee of Australia Wind Energy 2021. I feel very honored to host today's webinar. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the theme of today's webinar, Australia's wind energy landscape. Australia's wind energy had its record year in 2019 with 6.3 gigawatts accumulative installation capacity and a dominant contribution to the power generation. In addition to the steady growth of onshore source, this country has been on the road to the first offshore wind farm, which is in its feasibility phase and located along the coast of Gippsland in Victorian. The webinar is set up to help international companies to have a comprehensive understanding of Australia's wind power market. Furthermore, we'd like to share the latest trend, issue, and innovation with many of domestic players. And please kindly find the agenda of today's webinar on this slide. I'm pleased Ms. Laura Pentecoff from BloombergNEF Finance, Eileen Kosolo from Baker McKenzie, and Emma Woos from ACCIONA speaking at the webinar. Please note that each speaker has 20 minutes for the presentation and the following 10 minutes for Q&A session. We'll show a few questions selected from the pre-registrants on the slide. If the time allows, 1 or 2 questions from the live audiences will be answered by the speakers orally as well. I'm also pleased to welcome these industry representatives attending the webinar. In addition to domestic specialists, they are from Europe, North Asia, and Southeast Asia. Next, I would like to introduce my company, Leader Associates, to all of you. Leader Associates is a leading global renewable energy event organizer. You can see our strong track records and partnerships across 5 continents from the slide. And finally, we would like to give some tips to our audience. If you have any technical issues, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions to speakers, please use the Q&A box next to the chat box. Speakers can answer your questions online, and there are 10 minutes will be left for each speaker to orally answer pre-registered questions. The slides and the recordings will be shared by email link within 1 week. Firstly, let me introduce the speaker, Laura Pentecoff, Renewable Energy Analyst from the BloombergNEF Finance. Laura Pentecoff is a research analyst at BloombergNEF, specializing in global and Australian large-scale renewables. She examined the financing of wind and solar projects, power markets, as well as corporate sustainability strategy. Before joining Bloomberg, Laura spent 2 years working at Tesla Energy, helping launch Powerwall 2 to the APAC region, as well as working on the early phases of the South Australia's virtual power plant. And Laura will speak on Australia wind energy outlook. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Mabel. Thanks for having me. How are you doing?
Yes, could you please share your screen now and start your presentation?
Great. All right, just waiting for that to start. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Pentecoff. I'm a renewable energy analyst at BloombergNEF. So BloombergNEF, or BNEF, is an independent research house with over 250 professionals across 17 locations in the world. And we're part of the wider Bloomberg LP network. So our research not only covers the clean energy transition, but also many other areas in emerging technologies, such as agriculture, digital industry, and metals and mining. So we help our clients grapple with finance, policy, and sustainability, and also helping them navigate these changes. So today I want to talk to you about the changes that are going on in Australian wind. 2018, wind investment peaked in Australia. There was about $3.7 billion USD of projects in the sector. This accounts to about 2.5 gigawatts of capacity. However, the next year, we saw an enormous drop to about $1.7 billion USD. Now, for a bit of context, this is less than the 2010 value, which was about $2 billion. And this year, we're on the track to have a much lower value as well, with only about $400 million so far invested into the sector. Now, why did this happen? We first have to look at the large-scale renewable energy target, or the LRET. Now, the LRET drove a massive investment, a massive build over the last few years, and there was perceived scarcity of large-scale generation certificates, or LGCs. So the price rose to about $93 Australian per megawatt hour. However, once there was enough capacity that secured finance, the price dropped. It's now at around $30 to $40 a megawatt hour, and it looks like it's going to continue to drop further. So future prices suggest that by 2023, prices will be around $10 a megawatt hour. So aren't really going to compensate projects and drive any new capacity. So the LRET has run its course. And what is going to happen next? Well, it looks like the future of federal energy policy is very uncertain. There seems to be a lack of support for renewable energy, at least direct renewable energy support, but also it's very unclear for investors what the future is going to hold. Now we've seen a patchwork of proposals, schemes, targets. We saw the technology investment roadmap and a bit of a shift towards reliability with the underwriting new generation investment scheme. And then also feasibility grants given to coal plants such as the one in Queensland and Collinsville. So it seems really that the government has stepped away from not only directly supporting renewable energy, but also robustly really facilitating this inevitable transformation of the grid. Now, on top of that, there's problems emerging on this grid. So as we said, with the LRET, there was a large build out of renewable energy. Now, many of these projects went in remote and weaker areas of the grid in order to take advantage of favorable wind and solar resources. However, more and more issues began to crop up. One of the problems affecting investors most is probably marginal loss factors. So marginal loss factors, or MLFs, are a static multiplier that is assigned to generators in the NEM, and this is meant to account for transmission losses and is changed annually. There's a lot of uncertainty for some projects of what this MLF will change to each year. Now, some MLFs can be as low as 0.75. Now, just on the chart on the right here, the map of the east coast of Australia, you can see that in this sort of northwest Victoria, southern New South Wales areas, the orange circles demonstrate very low MLFs. So an MLF of 0.75 means that for all the energy that is dispatched on the dollar, the project is only paid 75 cents. And this is going to become even more of a problem. There's about 6 gigawatts of capacity under construction currently, and this might lower the MLFs of operating projects nearby. And also those projects themselves might be assigned a lower MLF than they expected. Now, another problem on the grid is curtailment. So curtailment is generation that could have been generated, but was not. Now, in the first quarter of 2020, we found that in the NEM, there was 6% curtailment of wind. Now, a lot of that was economic curtailment, but a lot was also system strength curtailment. Now, this issues of system strength is really when there's not enough synchronous generation in that part of the grid. So not enough coal, hydro, gas, or synchronous condensers. And this means that in that part of the grid, there might be dangerous voltage oscillations if something like a transmission line goes down. You've probably heard of the West Murray region, where 5 solar plants had their max output cut by about 50% by the market operator. What we didn't know, or what is not quite spoken about that often, is that many wind generators were also affected. An example of this is the AGL's Silverton wind farm, where at nighttime it was allowed to operate. However, in the day it was cut from dispatching at all when other solar plants operated. And there's also more and more issues cropping up in northern Queensland to do with system strength. And then there's also frequency control ancillary service penalties, where plants are penalised when they deviate from dispatch targets set by AEMO. So there's some solar projects, for example, that have been penalised as high as $9 per megawatt hour, prorated across their generation. And wind is not exempt from this effect. The max projects were about $2 per megawatt hour, again, across the generation. Now, if you think about these issues on the grid as costs that developers have to wear and manage, we wanted to find out what these underlying costs represented for particular projects. Now, on the chart here, you can see Daydream Solar Farm. This is a solar farm in northern Queensland, and I use solar because it's the most obvious effect. So we have the implied LCOE, and then we add on the cost due to curtailment, due to MLFs or network losses, and also the frequency control ancillary service penalties. And what you get is this new cost, which for some projects can be 40% higher than the initial implied LCOE. Now, while electricity prices are high, these underlying costs are relatively hidden. However, as the value of electricity decreases, these costs become more apparent. And that's what's happening. Electricity prices are falling from their highs in 2017 and 2018. There's a variety of reasons for this. One is decreasing demand, mostly from more rooftop PV, but there's also decreasing fuel prices and more large-scale renewables on the grid that are decreasing overall average electricity prices. And further to that, the value of wind is dropping even faster. Now here, the chart on the left, you can see in blue, the realized price of wind. Think of this as the spot price when wind generators generate across the NEM. So think of it a bit more as value rather than actual revenue, because there might be different contracting arrangements with different specific plants. Now, what we found in the first quarter of 2020, that wind was valued at 31% below what we call the around-the-clock price. Here it says ATC. So this is the average price of all generators when they generate. Now, a lot of this is due to when the periods of when wind generates. Many other wind plants are also generating, and the prices go down, such as in South Australia. And this is going to keep getting worse. The value of wind will keep declining. Now, we model power prices out to 2030, and we found that the realized price, the value of wind, will keep declining out to about 2033. Might plateau a bit, but there's also a potential it might go up again slightly. Now, this is because of retiring coal generators later in the 2020s. Now, everything I said there really sounds quite terrible, and in some ways it is, but what I want to stress is that there will still be drivers for new wind. It's not all doom and gloom. So we said that federal governments are really making things unclear for investors, but state governments are setting ambitious renewable energy targets. So in some states, there's targets out to 2025, targets out to 2030. Some are legislated and some are not. And you also have states like New South Wales, who are coordinating the state's first renewable energy zone. Now, these are coordinated areas of transmission, which could host gigawatts of capacity. The first two zones alone should probably host about 3 and 8 gigawatts. Now, one thing we did was we looked at these targets and we aggregated them together, and we found how much renewable capacity, how much renewable generation, could this drive by 2030. And what we found was this represented about 35%. But if you add on top rooftop PV and other projects that have already secured finance, as well as just one renewable energy zone in New South Wales, you can easily get Australia past 50% renewable generation by 2030. And large corporations are going to continue to support both new and operating projects. So the RE100, there is now 12 members, I think, so far. Suncorp just joined recently. And now this is a pledge where the companies, they agree that they are going to source 100% renewable energy by a certain date. And there's also many other companies across Australia who are setting their own independent targets. Now, aside from sustainability, many corporates are also looking to a steady long-term price and also potentially want to save money in the long term. We've also seen several global companies wanting to green their operations in Australia, and most recent PPAs were signed. There was 2 by Amazon and 2 by Aldi. Now, we said that grid constraints cause extra cost for wind plants. However, the cost of wind is it's getting very cheap. Now, every 6 months, we do a study into the LCOEs of many technologies in dozens of countries across the world. So LCOEs is levelized cost of electricity. We chat to developers, equipment suppliers, and also financiers, and we find how things such as CapEx, OpEx, and lending change over time. And what we find is that Australia has some of the cheapest wind in the world. It's getting there, probably close to Brazil and the United States, that are slightly cheaper so far. And in Australia, PV and wind are both the cheapest forms of generation, and these both beat out gas and coal. Now, just to note, the reason coal is currently so expensive is that it's really the cost of lending is so high due to added risk. Now, in that way, there isn't really going to be any coal plants built unless there's significant government support. So the cost of wind is going to continue to get cheaper, and it'll get more cheaper than both coal and gas over time. So this is a new coal plant versus a new wind plant. This is mostly a combination of decreasing CapEx and OpEx, but also increasing yield and performance, just better capacity factors and equipment. And if you look at this in terms of just the cost of operating coal, wind is fast approaching both that cost and also gas. Now, you might be thinking, what about the dispatchable characteristics of coal? How could just wind compete with that? Well, the cost of lithium-ion batteries is just getting so cheap that that wind plus storage can easily outcompete new coal and soon new gas plants. So here on the chart, we modeled so this is a wind plant, and it's paired with the top line of the purple is a storage plant that is sized to 100% of the capacity. So these are long duration storage, so 4-hour storage. Then we also have 50% the capacity of the wind plant and 25%. So you can see that this dispatchable, combined co-located dispatchable project gets much cheaper in 10 or so years' time. And this really matters because coal in Australia is aging and is going to retire. We haven't built a new coal plant in 10 years, and as I said, we probably never will. Now, we look into every coal plant across Australia every couple of years, and we figure out when we think those coal plants might retire, or if we think they're viable for life extension. We look at things such as their operational flexibility, if the equipment is aging, but also other things such as the supply of coal in that particular area, and also ash waste disposal. So what we found is that by 2035, an almost 66% of Australia's coal will have reached its retirement age or will retire early. Now, what's going to replace it? Well, we do another study, which is called our New Energy Outlook, which looks into what will be built in Australia, for example, once these coal plants retire on a least cost basis. And what we find that these coal plants will be replaced by about, I think it was 57 gigawatts of capacity. And at least 11 gigawatts of that will be wind. Now, one thing I haven't really mentioned that much in this presentation is the effect of COVID-19 on the wind industry. Now, we all probably know already that everyone involved is going to have to adapt to this new reality, whether that be sort of changing operations, dealing with a tougher lending environment potentially, equipment constraints, among many other things. So at BNEF, we modelled wind forecasts out to 2025. We used a couple of different COVID-19 related scenarios, and we found, well, firstly I'll just explain these a little bit. So a single wave pandemic is just one wave. It's, still could happen in Australia, but this means that economic recovery can start later in 2020. a multi-wave pandemic, all the way to an enduring pandemic. So an enduring pandemic is many uncontrolled outbreaks over time, and economic recovery can't start until a treatment or vaccine is found, possibly late 2021. However, when we modeled this, we found that the projects that are already under construction, they're all going to be built and connected over the next 1 to 2 years or so. Perhaps an enduring pandemic, some might be pushed out into 2022. And then after that, in all scenarios, you see a kind of slant downwards. It's a bit of a slowdown. So this is not really related to COVID-19. It's more related to all the issues I just spoke about. So uncertain federal policy, the decreasing value of wind generation, and also these problems on the grid. However, after that, you can see activity picks up slightly again. Now, a lot of this is from New South Wales renewable energy zones, and also several projects that are backed by CleanCo in Queensland. So going forward, if the cost of wind continues to decrease, if corporate PPA activity is sustained, and also if these aging coal clunkers start to retire, there's still opportunities for many wind generators to find their feet. Thanks very much. And yeah, are there any questions, Mabel?
Hello, Laura. Yeah, thanks a lot for your excellent presentation, and I will share the screen to show the questions. Yes, and the first question is, what are the key challenges in Australia's wind energy industry?
Yeah, okay. So I guess, as I said through the presentation, the biggest challenges are definitely federal policy, issues on the grid, and decreasing value of wind. But I might take this question as more as what I think are the most pressing, most serious challenges that we should think about at the moment. Now, the first one I would say is problems on the grid. So your MLFs, curtailment due to system strength issues. Now, a lot of these problems were actually unforeseen by many developers and many investors. So it's been extremely unsettling for them to see, for instance, their projects cut by 50% capacity, or other things like having to add synchronous generators to their project. So we saw a few investors, such as John Lang in particular, decided to actually exit the Australian market, citing MLFs specifically as a reason why they want to leave. Another part of grid issues that I didn't quite get to talk much about was grid connection delays, which is causing a lot of problems, like especially contracting risk between EPCs and also developers. You've probably heard of Biosar, Downer, Decmill, to some extent exit the Australian market for certain types of contracts. And then, so we really need a very robust and very certain investment environment to keep these projects and keep this investment in Australia. So that would really bring me to the next point, which is the next most serious, which is policy. So as we probably all know, it's been a very crazy, tumultuous decade in Canberra. It doesn't seem like any sort of robust renewable energy policy can be passed. And this is just hindering investment. Now, as I said, the state policies will help, especially over the next sort of 1 to 5 years. However, eventually we're going to need some sort of mass coordination between the states and federal. Now, even if you just take it in terms of Paris commitments, we're going to have to find very coordinated ways to really deal with our decarbonisation at some point. So again, stresses again, what we want is investment certainty, and we don't particularly want many different state rules, so there's different criteria for different developers and investors. And we also don't want investors to keep worrying about crazily changing political cycles. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Laura, and the second question is what does the offshore wind landscape look like for Australia in the next decade?
Yeah, great. So yes, there's a lot of chat about offshore wind these days. So what I will start off with saying is that offshore wind is, well, it's in its infancy at the moment. There's really a lot of steps that Australia has to take before we can get to a really mature market like the UK, China, Germany. Now there's all sorts of steps. There's clarifying regulation, planning of the networks, environmental approvals, and also even scaling our local supply chain. You still need very specific transport and construction companies for this different type of asset. So the next thing is that any first project of its kind in a particular region, or the first few projects, the first maybe 2 to 5 gigawatts, they're not going to be cheap. They're going to be extremely expensive. And then once we start implementing more of these projects, our experience curve is going to go down. We can sort of streamline operational costs, and overheads. And then we also need active investment. And so this probably goes back to how I answered the first question. I think for offshore wind to really take off, we'll need more government support and government certainty. Otherwise, I can't really see it being built over the next decade.
So the third question is, what will be the likely average wind project size in coming 3 years in Australia?
Yeah, good question. So I don't think it will be really a set average. My take on this is that the size of wind projects will probably diverge in a way. So you have on one side your big mega projects, on the other side much smaller projects. So on the larger side of things, I think you'll see projects that are, hundreds and hundreds, maybe 1 gigawatt size, and they'll be able to use really the economics of scale, so the economies of scale, and really this superior buying power in order to get these very cheap prices. And also it can really justify any network build out that's required. So a great example of this is actually the McKenzie wind farm in Queensland. And I'm sure Emma will have a bit to say about that later. Now, the other thing I said was the small size projects. So I think this small size projects, because firstly, from a network perspective, they can fit in different parts of the network and you have less restrictions, especially if they're non-scheduled and under 30 megawatts. And also if they're off-grid. So we've seen a few co-located off-grid mine sites that include at least some wind turbines. But at the same time, while I do think that this middle will be hollowed out, I can imagine that maybe projects in New South Wales, renewable energy zones, or some more Queensland projects that are backed by CleanCo might be around this mid-range. So a little bit all over the place, but mostly divergence. Thanks.
Okay, and the last question from registrants is, has COVID situation stifled the investment, and if so, when will the appetite return?
Yes, all right, so this is a bit of a long one. So first of all, it's quite hard to see through data so far if COVID-19 has stifled investment. We'll only really know this over the next year or so. Now, to really understand how I think it could stifle investment or just make things difficult for everyone involved, is we have to think about two different types of projects. So first, there's the post-financial close, so already under construction, and then the pre-financial close, so still contracting or still developing, early stages of development of the project. So post-financial close, we'll, again, might hear from the others a little bit more about this, is probably operations have been impacted, some construction delays. You might have engineers that are traveling from overseas to do commissioning, for instance, are having just more issues getting to site. And also we might see, especially with the more intensifying pandemic, we might see more supply chain disruptions, so wind turbines can't actually be delivered on time. Now, I can't see that being too bad. I think the worst effects will be on the pre-FID, which is I think what this question is really asking. So there's three things here that I think will most affect wind. Firstly, the macroeconomic conditions, the supply chain, a little bit like what I just said before, and also this extra contractual risk. I'm sure Aylin might talk about this. Now, from a macroeconomics perspective, I know that a lot of investors and developers are fearing that operational demand might go down. Now, although we don't know so far, we don't actually know how bad the pandemic is going to get. We don't know if a extremely awful recession is going to shut lots of businesses or even a big load such as an aluminium smelter. and that could cause prices to collapse. That's definitely one big risk that I'm sure a lot of developers are dealing with. Supply chain, it's a little bit like it's already under construction. It might be hard to secure enough turbines from several factories that could be impacted by a worsening pandemic. But one I've also heard about is contractual problems. So ones nearing contractual close might suddenly be thinking about all the different risks that occur and how risk is allocated and if they want a premium to take on that risk. One thing, for example, is force majeure clause. When can that be used in the contract? So as to when appetite will return, well, I think that there was going to be a slowdown anyway. So policy issues, grid issues, just all sorts of issues, especially over the next couple of years, we're definitely going to see a slowdown in investment. I think that, hopefully with the COVID situation, at least improved over the next couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years time, we'll start to see that appetite to invest again, provided that federal policy is more in line and provided we can deal with these grid issues. Yeah, thanks, Mabel.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And we select one question from the live audience. Is it about what skills or supplier capacity are needed to ensure onshore wind can be constructed at reducing cost?
Yeah, so the question was what skills are needed for onshore wind to be constructed at a different cost?
Yes.
I guess, well, what I can think of so far, this is probably not my specialty area, but I think that you'll definitely need to, especially in the pandemic, probably there'll be, need to be refined operations so that you don't need to have as many people on site, perhaps even things like virtual commissioning, things like that. One thing that could save a cost that we're hearing more and more about, especially in our digital industries team, is things like predictive maintenance, improved digital systems there. Also using drones, for instance, drone photography to help save cost, especially to help save O&M costs. So those are probably the main ones. So I reckon AEMO will probably have many more. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Zahar. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we go to the next part. Let's welcome the, wait a minute. Okay, let's welcome the second speaker, Aline Kosomo, partner from Baker McKenzie. Aline is partner in the Energy and Projects team at Baker McKenzie. Aline specializes in renewable and clean energy project development, energy regulatory matters, and energy contracting, including hedging and offtake arrangements, connection arrangements, retail arrangements, and M&A transactions in the energy and the resources sectors. She will be discussing on the regulatory environment of renewable energy development in Australia. Hello, Aline. Could you please share your screen now?
Hi, Mabel.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone on the webinar. Nice to join you today. I'll just share my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Is everyone able to see my screen? Mabel,
yes, you can start now.
Great, thank you.
Good.
So as Mabel mentioned, I'm a partner at Baker McKenzie in the major projects group. Today I'll be focusing on the Australian regulatory environment for renewable energy development. We're looking at some of the key reforms that are helping to facilitate the transformation of our energy system and focusing in particular on grid reform, as well as highlighting offshore wind regulation recent reforms, as well as reforms to support hybrid and storage projects and provide an overview of federal and state renewable energy policies. In Australia, the primary market is the national electricity market. It covers approximately 80% of Australia's consumption. It's a wholesale electricity market which is operated by AEMO. Generators receive a spot price for electricity and enter into bilateral offtake arrangements with retailers or corporate buyers to hedge their exposure to the volatility of the market price. WA, the Northern Territory, have got their own electricity systems and separate regulatory arrangements, and I'll focus primarily on the NEM, or the National Electricity Market, in this presentation. In Australia, energy is the responsibility of the states, and the states have conferred their power to the Council of Australian Governments, or COAG. Just recently, COAG has been replaced by the National Federation Reform Council. Sitting under that council is the Energy Security Board, which was tasked by COAB to design a long-term, fit-for-purpose market framework to support reliability that could apply from 2025. We're expecting by the end of this year for the ESB to recommend changes to the existing national electricity market design, or recommend an alternative market design to deliver a secure, reliable and lower emissions electricity system at least cost. The current priority for the ESB is reliability. The ESB is consulting with the other key regulators in the process, and these are the ANC, who's the rule maker, AEMO, who is the operator of the market, and AER, which is the rule enforcer. The key reforms that the ESB are looking at include immediate actions, mid-term actions, and long-term actions. As part of the immediate actions, the ESB is looking at interim reliability and security measures and actions to implement the priority renewable energy zones, as well as actionable ISP rule changes. In the midterm, the ESB is looking at reforms such as ahead markets, two-sided markets, and access reform involving the coordination of generation and transmission investment, or CAGATI. In the longer term, the ESB is looking to reforms relating to investment signals, ageing thermal generator strategy and initiatives, as well as development of DER markets with implementation post-2025. This slide here sets out each of the key areas of reforms that the ESB is looking at. As you can see, there's a large range of reforms that have been addressed. It's not just by the ESB, but also by the ANC, AEMO and AER. In this presentation, I'll focus mainly on the grid-related reforms, which is of particular relevance to development of wind. And this slide here shows the work program of the ESB. It sets out some of the actions that have already been done, immediate actions which are being implemented currently, as well as the mid-term and longer term, and shows the timing there. So focusing on grid reforms, Alara has touched on already in some detail the current context in the national electricity market in terms of grid congestion and reliability and security issues. And transmission reform is really a key focus of the regulators, industry bodies and market participants. The issue has really arisen because of the integration of non-synchronous renewable generation and the introduction of new technologies such as behind-the-meter systems, including solar PV, which have been particularly popular in Australia. The NEM was designed to accommodate a one-way flow of energy from generation, transmission, distribution to the consumer. The introduction of new technologies which export energy back to the grid have created system security issues and also challenges due to the lack of visibility by the market operator and network service providers. The integration of new technologies has been coupled with ageing of traditional coal-fired generators which have previously provided inertia, which non-synchronous generators are unable to provide. Reform and new infrastructure is required to the transmission network in order to cater for these technologies and to find new ways to provide stability to the grid. The West Murray Zone, which Lara's also pointed out, is really an example of the system security issues that are occurring in the NEM. But just to emphasise, these are localised issues. It's not the case that the entire grid is suffering from stability issues, but what has happened, and this is what has happened in the West Murray Zone, is that there's been a number of renewable generators that have sought to develop in areas of high resource, a good resource, but where the grid is weak. And this has created issues in terms of curtailment by AEMO. So the West Murray region involved curtailment of 5 solar farms, up to 50% of their generation output. And that occurred for over a period of 7 months, when ultimately the issue was solved through the collaboration between AEMO, the network service providers, and affected solar farms. There was an inverter-based solution which allowed the solar farms to operate in harmony. The projects that were in line to connect were also significantly delayed. There are other areas within the grid, such in Queensland, which are also suffering from system strength issues. And what we're seeing is that AEMO is, in light of these issues, is reviewing previously agreed and negotiated generator performance standards. So it was previously the case that when a project goes through the connection process, they would have their GPES approved, and there's a negotiation process around that. There would be certainty that those GPS would continue to be implemented as negotiated during the project development phase. But what we're seeing now is, once the project has reached financial close and is constructed and going through the final testing process, that AEMO is often re-looking at that GPS that was previously agreed. And this is creating delays in projects getting online and causing issues for the projects. There's also been some concerns and impacts on contractors. For example, RCR, who went insolvent in Australia, one of the key reasons that they were suffering is because of the significant AEMO grid-related risk that they had taken on. And what we're seeing now is that construction contractors are not willing to take on as much delay or connection risk that's outside of their control as they would have previously because of the uncertainty in the process. So this really means that the developers have to manage this risk or try and push it through to their off-takers, but in a buyer-friendly off-take market, that can be challenging as well. So this is really the context now for the significant reforms that have been contemplated by AEMO and the ESB, and a key document and plan is the Integrated System Plan. AEMO has recently released the latest ISP in July, and the ISP is a plan to inform participants about the development of the transmission system and provide a signal for investment. It's an actionable plan for the development of the transmission system. Its key highlights include that there's an immediate need for active investment in renewable resources to replace retired or retiring coal-fired sources and to provide grid stability. It sets out its transition plan for managing retirement of its coal sources, including a combination of solar, wind storage, flexible gas, and investment in the transmission system. And this slide here shows the timing of coal-fired generation, which is expected to retire, and the corresponding capacity. This is a key driver to the ISP. The ISP has identified 4 categories of transmission projects, which are permitted to develop by the transmission network service provider through the RIT process. So the Group 1 committed ISP projects include the South Australian System Strength Remediation, which will be completed in 2021, the Western Victoria Transmission Network Project, Queensland to New South Wales Interconnector. The Group 2 actionable ISP projects to be completed by mid-2020 include Victorian and New South Wales Interconnector, Project Energy Connect, Humlink, and Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone. Also in Group 2, but with a later date of early 2030s, include the VNI West Interconnector, Marinus Link. And lastly, in Group 3 is the group of projects which are the future ISP projects for the mid-2030s and beyond, including Queensland to New South Wales Interconnector, 3 Queensland augmentations, 3 in New South Wales, and also 2 in South Australia. And as Lara mentioned, that renewable energy zones is also another key mechanism to support the implementation of the ISP. And it's been undertaken by the states, but complementing the ISP. So the idea of a renewable energy zone is to create areas of development of renewable energy projects and storage where there's a good resource, and to carry out coordinated upgrades to the transmission network in those areas. New South Wales is sort of leading the way with the initial development of the renewable energy zones. The first is Central West Arana. In June 2020, New South Wales saw private sector interest. The responses indicate that there's 27,000 megawatts of new energy generation and storage projects, representing a total possible investment of 38 billion. The New South Wales has announced budget support for the renewable energy zone of around 40 million. And the next one is the New England Renewable Energy Zone, which was announced in July this year. And again, the government has announced budget support, and for that zone, it's around 78.9 million. There are also renewable energy zones being developed in other states, including Queensland, Victoria, and Tasmania. And just recently, Transgrid has announced that it's developing its own new model for the provision of enabling transmission infrastructure. And it's using the New England Renewable Energy Zone as a trial. It released an EOI for an innovative commercial model to be directly funded by renewable energy participants in exchange for firm capacity to connect transmission infrastructure and unlock private investment. The submissions were due in just recently in 29th of July, and there's an option to be held in 27th of August. So I think this is just one example of the type of commercial model that could evolve as part of the renewable energy zones, but this is where it's going to get interesting, and I think it's definitely a space to watch. Another sort of key reform in the transmission area, which was originally being considered by the AMC, but has now been considered as part of the post-2025 market design reforms, is Kagadi. Kagadi will replace the existing marginal loss factor regime, and it will involve paying a generator based on a local dynamic price, so trading interval, which reflects congestion in the area. Retailers will continue to pay a regional price for the purchase of electricity, and the idea is that the local price will incentivise generators to factor in congestion when choosing a project site. AEMO will run an option of financial transmission rights available to generators, which will hedge the difference between the local and the regional reference price. However, at this stage, it's expected the hedges will only cover up to around a maximum of 5 years term, and they won't be available to all participants. What the concern in the market is around this reform is that there's a potential gap risk for generators who enter into a typical offtake agreement structured as a contract for difference. If they're getting paid the local price, they will most likely be required to pass through the regional reference price to the retailer, which creates a gap risk between the price they're getting paid by AEMO and the price that they're required to pass through to the retailer or the corporate off-taker. The hedges that will be optioned are designed to cover that risk, but the shorter term doesn't align with sort of long-term off-take agreements that you see in the market, and there could be limited availability. So these issues are being worked through as part of the reform, but we do expect that there will be grandfathering arrangements available for existing projects. But it does mean for new projects that congestion, when you're planning a location site, congestion is an important factor, not just from the point of view grid delays and potential curtailment, but potentially if Kagadi is implemented, it could create an additional revenue risk. The states are also introducing some of their own reforms. In Victoria, it has announced an amendment to the National Electricity Act, which gives Victoria the power to unlock renewable projects and improve reliability of energy supply. The general idea or the main objective is to speed up the RIT process, which is a lengthy process for transmission investment that exists in the market currently. However, it needs to weigh that up against ensuring that there's good value for consumers. The ESB has also been looking at ways that we can speed up the RIT process so that critical transmission infrastructure can be available faster, and that has led to an actual ISP final rule recommendation and associated rule change. And New South Wales has also indicated that an intention to enact a similar derogation like Victoria has. But just moving on now to offshore wind. So Australia generally has been a bit slow to adopt offshore wind, and there's currently no regulatory framework that applies for its development. However, the Australian government is looking at developing that framework, which involves a commercial licensing regime. And in the meantime, Copenhagen Infrastructure Partnership has started developing its first offshore project, the Star of the South, which is being considered under existing planning regulations. In January 2020, the Australian government developed a discussion paper outlining its proposed regulatory framework for the exploration, construction, operation and decommissioning of offshore wind, and sought for feedback on this paper in February 2020. At this stage, there's no bill that has been released yet, so we haven't seen the draft legislation. But what we're expecting is that the regulatory framework will mirror the structure of the regulatory framework that applies to offshore exploration gas, which is the proposal. So it will involve a commercial licensing regime for feasibility studies, long-term development and pre-commercial activities. There'll be a separate non-exclusive transmission and infrastructure permit for construction and operation of transmission and other infrastructure. It's a bit hard to see this slide, but when it's circulated, hopefully you'll be able to, but it's a summary of the proposed regulatory process to support the development of offshore wind. So I'll just touch on briefly to, we're running out of time, there is significant reforms that are being introduced to support hybrid projects, which will be relevant to wind projects incorporating storage, and a key reform is the introduction of a new bidirectional resource provider registered participant, which will provide and manage one offer and respond to a single dispatch instruction for each service, and aggregates physical capabilities and optimizes between components of the hybrid system. And this has been introduced to recognise that the existing rules really aren't fit for purpose and don't facilitate the participation of hybrid projects in the network. And we're expecting these reforms to be implemented to address that. Another key area is frequency control, ancillary services reform. The ANC found that existing FCAS frameworks don't continue to deliver efficient market outcomes, and is looking at reforming the market to create additional incentive for fast frequency control services, which can be provided by batteries, and again, relevant in the context of hybrid projects. And lastly, I'll just touch on government policy to support renewables. As you're probably aware, the main federal policy that has existed in Australia and that has supported the development of renewables has been the Renewable Energy Target. In September 2019, the Clean Energy Regulator announced that Australia had met the RET more than a year ahead of schedule, and is due to expire in 2030. At this stage, there's nothing that has been announced to replace the federal scheme. However, on the state level, there's a number of state-based targets and policies which Lara also mentioned, and they're represented on this slide. And these have been, these will be supported by various policy levers, such as the power purchase agreements with the state government, direct investment, and battery storage tenders. And this is our team. We have a team with extensive experience at Baker and McKenzie across the various areas that are relevant to the development of wind, from core energy services as well as corporate and financial services as well. So I'll turn now to questions.
And yes, thanks for the great presentation, Nadine. And then now I will share the screen to show the questions for you. Hope everyone can see it. Okay, so the first question is that do you think it will be possible to get PPAs for offshore wind in Australia?
Yes, thank you, Mabel. I mean, as I mentioned, offshore wind is really at the early stages of development in Australia. But as it evolves, I think it will create an opportunity for PPAs, and on at least an even playing field with other wind projects. The projects will be connecting into the grid on the mainland, and will be paid a spot price equivalent to those on the mainland. So there's no reason why there couldn't be a PPA that's entered into with a retailer or an off-taker that's looking to hedge their exposure to the spot price, and that there wouldn't be a basis risk, leaving aside the Gippsland reforms, which I have mentioned, that would pay a local price. Otherwise, you would expect the offshore project to be paid the same spot prices as the projects which are located on land, which means that there wouldn't be a basis risk that the retailer or corporate would be assuming. So I think, and generally there's an appetite for wind from buyers in the market. So I see that it would certainly be possible to get a PPA, but as I say, at this stage, because the offshore wind market is evolving, it's really speculation.
Okay, let's go to the next question. It's about what differentiates financing between onshore and offshore wind.
Yeah, so again, look, because onshore wind is much more, is a mature market that attracts private investment, and previously it also attracted public investment, for example, through the CFC, although I understand that they're moving away from onshore wind now. In terms of financing offshore wind, I think at this point you would see that as being primarily privately financed, but it's possible if it's a bit of a novel project that it could get the interest of the CFC, for example. But in terms of the differentiation from financing, the challenges are going to be that it's a new type of project, but the process would be the same as compared to onshore.
Okay. Yes. Let's see the third question. That is, how can we manage the current grid or connection risk and the uncertainty in Australia's east coast, and how much is the regulated capacity?
Yeah, so thanks, Mabel. Look, I mean, really the most effective strategy for managing risk uncertainty is to locate the project in an area which is not congested. To date, it has been challenging because there hasn't really been any visibility around grid connections. So there are projects who've gone through the connection process unaware that there have been other projects also seeking to connect at that region. and then getting to the point of connection and finding out that another project had just got there in time, which has resulted in reduced capacity being available for that project. So that has been a real challenge, and the way the regime exists currently is that network service providers have an obligation to review and consider connection applications, and can't refuse an application that has been made in accordance with the rules, but have the ability to curtail or limit the capacity and the export capacity if it needs to support the security of the system. But this is exactly the system that is being looked at by the ESB, and the key purpose of the integrated system plan, which is being put out by AEMO, is to give visibility to private investors as to where there will be new transmission planning and infrastructure. And then the renewable energy zones are also designed to be an area of good resource, as well as one where there'll be focused and concentrated transmission development as a way of sort of encouraging new projects to develop there and mitigate against the grid risk and connection uncertainty. In terms of the second part of that question, how much is the regulated capacity? So as I mentioned, at this under the current system, there isn't really any regulated capacity, in the sense that each project is given an allocated share of capacity, but that's one potential option that's being looked at. And the Transgrid commercial model that I mentioned, that involved auctioning or provision of capacity to different projects in return for contribution to investment in transmission, so that they were given firm capacity as a result. So that's sort of the premise underlying that particular model. So I think as the renewable energy zones develop, we'll start to see different models like that, and it could be that there is fixed capacity allocated to projects as a way of getting greater certainty around your ability to export it at the maximum capacity of the project.
Okay, thanks for answering, Elaine. And now we got to the last question. As to what extent has uncertainty in Australia's policy and regulatory settings limited the investment climate?
Thanks, Mabel. Look, I think the number one challenge for investment in Australia has been concerns around the grid and marginal loss factors in particular, as Lara mentioned. So I think that's been the main concern, and the reason why some international investors have looked elsewhere. And again, that's the key focus of the reforms that have been looked at. At the secondary level, uncertainty in Australia's policy and regulatory settings. I mean, particularly emissions reduction, renewable energy policy has been inconsistent, and there has been significant uncertainty. I think that certainly hasn't helped the investment climate in Australia, but I'm hopeful as part of the ESB's reform, this is really a centralised all of market reform that's focusing on each of the areas that need to be addressed to support the integration of renewables. I'm hopeful, and that's the key objective of those reforms is to create greater certainty, and that should help address the issues that have been previously perceived in the market.
Okay, Ellen, thanks for your answering. And in order to control the timing, we will not leave time for the Q&A box from the live audience, but speakers can answer them online during the webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mabel.
Okay. Yes, let's go to the next speaker. Okay, let's welcome Emma Oos, Business Development Manager from ACCIONA, to speak on key phases of developing a wind farm in Australia. Emma is a senior development manager with global experience developing billion-dollar clean energy projects, including onshore and offshore wind farms, solar and battery storage projects. Emma currently oversees the development of new greenfield, large-scale wind, solar, and battery storage projects in Australia for ACCIONA. Presently, this includes a pipeline of over 2 gigawatts of early-stage projects in New South Wales and Victoria. Hello, Emma. Could you please share your screen now?
I'm able, sure. So I'm just sharing now. If you want to let me know once it's good to go. Is that it? Good to go?
Yes, it's lovely.
Perfect. Right, hi everyone. My name's Emma Woods, and I'm just going to run you through the contents of my presentation. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of ACCIONA, then on to the key phases of developing a wind farm in Australia, touching on some case study examples throughout, considerations and best practice. I could talk for quite some time on developing a wind farm in Australia, but I'm just going to focus on the key topics and almost walk through a development from start to finish and some of the key issues in Australia right now. So to start with, ACCIONA, we're a global company headquartered in Spain. Our core areas of business are displayed here, so predominantly infrastructure, renewable energy and water. But we do have several subsidiaries, but we're focused around sustainable infrastructure. So a good example is we have an electric scooter sharing business also that operates in Spain, Italy and Portugal called ACCIONA Mobility, but we're predominantly centred around sustainable infrastructure. In terms of energy specifically, we only own 100% renewable energy assets, and we have around 11 gigawatts either installed or under construction worldwide. And it's just also worth touching on the fact that we have a 36% share in Nordex, the wind turbine manufacturer. So therefore, we operate across the entire value chain of a wind farm, which may be different to some other wind farm developers. Lastly, just to touch on Australia, we've been operating in Australia now for over 15 years. And just displayed here are some of our assets running from the Waubra wind farm, which has now just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, over to some of our newer projects. Mortlake South is currently under construction in Western Victoria now. And Lara mentioned our McIntyre wind farm, which probably falls under one of those mega project examples, and that's due to start construction in 2021. I guess the only other point I'll make actually before we move on, just because it sets the context for the rest of the presentation. So for ACCIONA, all of our assets are 100% owned by us, with the exception of one JV. We don't sell our projects on, which can be a different model to how other investors and developers operate. Some may decide to develop and then sell the project on to someone else, and that can affect development timescales, investments and funding, which I'll touch on later throughout the presentation. Okay, so moving on to wind farm development, I'm going to use this example broadly of large-scale onshore wind farm development in Australia. I expect most of you are familiar with this chain of events of developing a wind farm. There are no major differences in Australia compared to other countries, except the timescales and the processes can vary throughout this chain. So the timescales and processes can vary throughout the chain, not just in Australia itself, but also individually in between each of the different states. So some activities can follow a linear fashion, prospecting, then moving on to development and engineering. But there are other activities that can occur throughout the entire life cycle of a wind farm. So a good example is securing a PPA for the sale of energy. It doesn't always happen at this phase here, right before financial close. For our McIntyre wind farm, we've secured a PPA for around 40% of the output whilst we're in the development and planning phase. So there are lots of activities that occur in parallel, but broadly speaking, it follows this route. Now, you're probably interested to know how long it can take to develop a wind farm in Australia? And that can be a hard question to give an exact number to. No project is exactly the same. So I've mapped here ACCIONA's assets. I can only talk on behalf of our projects to give you examples. But you can see here from point of inception all the way through to point of construction or anticipated construction for some of our projects. And I guess I just wanted to touch on some key kind of learnings from this slide. You can probably clearly see that there's no obvious correlation between megawatt capacity of a wind farm and the time it takes to develop. So sometimes it can take the same amount of time to develop 100 or 200 megawatt wind farm as it can to develop a 1,000 megawatt wind farm. The other thing I would touch on are some of our projects here that were acquired from other developers during that development phase. It enabled them to be built much quicker because someone else had done some of the pre-work before we worked on the project, and they were able to be developed, constructed, and then become operational within, say, 2 to 3 years. Whereas the lower section of the slides shows development projects that have started from what we call greenfield phase, and they can take much longer to progress. I guess it's also worth noting that, you know, in between the years that we're talking about here, several of these projects could have been impacted by political and economic changes that were going on in the background, and some of the other presenters have spoken about the tumultuous years we've had. Also, some projects may be paused at the developer's own choice. So generally it's very around 4 to 5 years is a good solid time frame for a wind farm development project. And I guess 2 points to note before I move on are that changing technology can affect your timeframes quite largely. So here in our Mortlake example, we've put the examples of the original planning permit and then a revised planning permit. So if you do have a pause in your project because of political or economic circumstances, the likelihood is if you pick that up again in a year or two's time, you may need to revise your planning permit, and many wind farms go through modification processes which can add extra time onto the back end of a project before you can start construction. And the other thing which I touched on earlier is that ACCIONA is headquartered in Spain, and we're very fortunate as well to be parent company financed. So for other wind farms, they may need to seek external finance, and that can also add on extra timescales, which aren't shown in my examples, but definitely should be factored in for other developments. So if we start at the outset of a wind farm, whether you've prospected that site or you've acquired it, these are just some of the factors that you need to consider at the early stage. This list is definitely not exhaustive. There could be many others. But maybe 10 or 15 years ago, wind speeds and grid, the first two highlighted here, would have been the most important factors to take into account. Now, as the industry and technology has matured, we're seeing more roadblocks and more factors and issues that need to be passed to get a wind development off the ground. Communities and government have become more educated, and hence it creates more policies that need to be adhered to for a wind farm development. So for example, Lara touched on marginal loss factors. That's probably something that wasn't really considered a few years ago as integral at the start of a wind farm, but it is definitely a key factor now, and a few wind farms have suffered as a result. So the reason why it's important to take a note of all of these at such an early stage, rather than just looking at high wind speeds or good grid access, is because you could concentrate on a few. Say you concentrate on numbers 1 to 9, and you progress through several years of your development. All of this spend is at risk of the project at this stage. But if you haven't taken into account what state you're likely to be operating in and what the energy pricing is in that state, then you'll probably find your wind farm may not progress to the construction stage. So hence it's very complex now in Australia to consider all of these factors right at the early outset of a wind farm. So moving on to development phase. Again, many of these core activities I'm sure you'll be familiar with: wind monitoring, early stage design, land agreements. They're not hugely different to other markets, but maybe some major issues to be aware of in Australia are that each of these activities will be different across the different states, different planning arrangements, different network operators, and each of these different rules can affect the time, the cost, the risk, and ultimately the design of your wind farm. Some will be quicker than others and some will be more complex. And that is quite a large investment risk to ensure that the developer is taking account of all of these issues, and so it won't slow down the schedule at a later date. So to give an example, there are some states where you may have one particular noise restriction in place and a setback that you need to adhere to for each wind turbine and the nearest dwelling. But in other states, you could have a completely separate distance and different noise and different visual restrictions and different planning guidelines. And of course, it's worth noting to those outside of Australia that the topography, the terrain, the population and the land uses vary greatly across each of the states, as do the community and their views towards wind farms. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly now, because it's definitely something we consider hugely important and is often underestimated in Australia. For ACCIONA, we own a project for its lifetime. So for us, it's a 30-year commitment and a relationship, but that impacts how we go about developing and engaging communities, and we make sure we do it right, and that can take some time. And that could be different depending on your business model. But for us, relationships are at the heart of how we operate. And one of the biggest problems we find is that wind farms can create winners versus losers. So those that may be hosting wind turbines in the community and receiving a rental income for hosting those turbines, versus those that are not, but they may experience the impacts of the wind farm and they're seeing no perceived benefit from having it in the community. So I wanted to touch on two case studies quickly. From our Mortlake wind farm, which is under construction in Victoria currently. So the first is regarding the transmission line. Despite having planning permission to install a connection line overhead to our substation about 16 kilometres away, after extensive community consultation, we decided to install that line underground. So that solution was more expensive and it impacted our schedule right at the back end as we're close to construction. But it was the best outcome from the local community, and we listened to those concerns. So underground would have no visual impact on the landscape, and it demonstrates our willingness to want to work with the community over the 30-year lifetime of the project. The next example here is our neighbourhood benefit programme. So this is trying to address the difference between those winners and losers that we mentioned. So this is a payment to people who own or rent dwellings within 4 kilometres of a wind turbine. It's a preloaded card that can only be spent locally to keep the benefits within the local Mortlake area. I'm just going to show a very quick video to show its impact on the local community.
I grew up in Camperdown, which is just 20 minutes down the highway, and my husband, who's also the co-owner obviously, he grew up here in Terang. We service mainly dairy farmers. They see it as a one-stop shop to get all their goods, but I mean, they might buy something that takes us 30 seconds to load on their ute, but often they're here for a lot longer than that, having a chat and socialising with the staff, because some of these farmers don't see many other people during the day or for a couple of days on end. A lot of our customers we know personally. The shop staff have got young children as well, and you get to know them in a small community.
We employ about 122. That includes after-school students and weekend students. A lot of our customers are parents of our existing employees or their family, essentially. So we've got a much closer tie with the general customer than you might have in the city. It was only probably about 18 months ago that I heard about the wind farm. Well, I think it's a great project for the community. It's not something that comes into the community and takes, it's giving back as well, so, which is very similar to the co-op.
The neighbourhood benefits program for the Mortlake South Wind Farm was tailored towards both landowners and neighbours as well as local businesses, so that the benefit was really shared out across the region. For everyone living within 4 kilometres of the Mortlake South Wind Farm, they're able to apply for a preloaded FPOS card, and you can use that up to the value at any of our 40 participating local businesses in Terang, Mortlake and Noorat. This neighbourhood benefits program is quite a new initiative for us and the first time that we have implemented it in Australia.
It's a great program in that it keeps money within the town, so it's kind of a no-brainer. The farmer dollar, it's crucial in our business.
I still find it hard to believe the generosity of the program. It is a chance to encourage people to shop locally, so our shoppers can look forward to their children having jobs locally.
Bigger farmers generally are using them to pay their accounts each month. It just gives them a bit of a leg up, and then the money stays in the economy within Terang and Mortlake. The last few years have been quite tough for the dairy industry around here. They're nearly operating at break even or worse. However, the milk price has certainly improved greatly. It is nice to see they're having a great silage and hay season this year. Yeah, no, they're all a lot happier.
So as you can see, it's really important for ACCIONA that it understands the communities in which it's operating in, and that we're implementing programs that are useful for the community as opposed to just ticking a box. And as you can see here, meaningful engagement throughout is key, and consultation and engagement isn't just one activity that you do when the wind farm's in planning. It never stops. It continues all the way throughout the life of a wind farm in Australia. Okay, so now you have your planning permit. You can now start to lock in your supply contracts and do more detailed engineering. Again, most of these activities you're probably familiar with, and we could talk about for quite some time, except I'm just going to focus on one aspect that's unique to Australia at the moment, which is local sourcing and supply chain. So I'll touch on COVID impacts separately, but it can have some foreseen benefits in that scenario. But procuring local labour and material is really a key consideration and a competitive advantage within Australia at the moment. Many state governments have got regional development strategies, and I can only see that increasing over time. And it's really important now where you're sourcing your labour from and what companies you're using to develop your project. Communities will be aware of it, governments will be aware of it, and corporates and potential energy off-takers will also be aware of it. So, you know, just using the cheapest form of procurement isn't necessarily the future way to develop a wind farm in Australia. So now if we move towards sale of energy and the financial close, the last element may be securing that PPA if you haven't done that already. Governments and corporates are constantly looking for ways to improve their sustainability metrics whilst reducing their consumption costs at the same time. PPAs are a key way to do that, or power purchase agreements. So I've got two case studies here. One is a PPA for 100 gigawatt hours from our Mount Gellibrand wind farm, which is in Victoria, constructed and finished in 2018. So we have a PPA in place with Viva Energy. They own the Geelong fuel refinery, which is not too far away from the site, and they've purchased a long-term agreement for the energy on that site. And then on the other side of the slide, you can see government state auctions. Both of the other presentations touched on this, but several state governments have renewable energy targets that they're working towards. And this presents opportunities for developers like us to participate in tenders for government-backed project development for either the PPA or the sale of green certificates that follow with that. And often these can be for 10 or 15-year periods, so it's a very good way to secure the backing of your wind farm. Some recent examples have included the Clinco R400 in Queensland and the Victorian Renewable Energy Target Reverse Auction, which is shown here on the slide. both of which ACCIONA has been fortunate enough to secure. The key difference between the two, I would point out, is that with the state government auctions, the project really needs to be ready at the right place and time to bid into that auction, whereas a corporate PPA can be negotiated separately at your own timeframes. So to touch on some examples, the first is a virtual PPA, which is effectively a contract for difference, or a CFD, be familiar with, and that's a standard PPA, and the Viva Energy example on the previous slide is the best example of that. A sleeved PPA is more of a contractual relationship with 3 parties involved, and it may be better for the corporate customer who doesn't want the complexity of 2 separate deals. They can do everything through their existing retailer and effectively ask the retailer to purchase green energy. And the last is the on-site PPA, otherwise known as behind the meter or a private wire, and this is effectively generating on-site and allowing the client to avoid network charges. Just to touch on some norms in the Australian market, typical term lengths of these long-term PPAs can be between 8 to 15 years. The LGCs that have been mentioned previously are the large-scale generation certificates, pretty similar to some other countries. They can also be traded along with the energy. And it's just to note that the volume of energy can vary. So a wind farm could have 1 or multiple PPAs in place. Okay, so now you're building your wind farm, and building a wind farm is pretty similar in most countries. No unusual complexities here. Has been difficult within Australia. There's lots I could cover here, but I just wanted to pick up some key points. There's no magic crystal ball to solve some of the commissioning issues that Aileen mentioned, but from our experience, we find it's best to be realistic in your planning and scheduling of the different whole point testing. Make sure you're scheduling enough time and risk into that schedule. Work closely with the network service providers, AEMO and the wind turbine provider. Make sure you've got the right partnerships in place. So that may be putting aside the contract and making sure everyone's working to the same goal, as opposed to just sticking to what's in your contractual obligations. And also expecting the unexpected for when things don't go to plan. And in the COVID environment, that's even more important. It is very much a live issue in Victoria at the moment, as you'll be aware. So far, we've been able to keep our Mortlake South Wind Farm under construction and just put mitigation measures in place. So, for example, you'll now see masks being worn on site. Pre-start meetings in the morning have been broken up to avoid mass gatherings. But we have noticed some impacts. There have been border restrictions that have affected us. As Lara mentioned, there's some skills that aren't available locally, and commissioning is a good example of that. Often commissioning managers will follow the turbines internationally, and that creates a problem when there's border restrictions of getting the right staff in place. We're also finding that, yes, manufacturing and logistics, there have been some delays. There have been some delays of deliveries to site, or there have been some elements where components are caught in other countries that are shut down, and therefore, even though we may be able to continue working here, we can't get that component delivered. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that other than wait for those issues to be resolved. And lastly, just to cover best practice. So what are the key things that we believe are important? Community consultation, I know I've touched on, but I could keep talking about it all day. It's heavily important to understand the community that you're operating in, and many wind farms have unfortunately been not progressed because they've underestimated that. Plan for changes and monitor all those risks as you go throughout the way. So often something at the start of the project that you didn't think would be a major risk turns out to be a risk later on. And lastly, innovation opportunities. So yeah, we mentioned drones earlier, and that's certainly something we are looking into. So currently, to monitor a wind turbine, you need a qualified engineer suspended either up high or on the ground. And this can be quite expensive, and it means you need to shut down the turbine for a few hours to do that. So we've been working on a prototype with Deakin University here in Victoria, using a new type of drone that will improve inspections in those high wind environments or unfavourable environments, and allow the wind turbine to keep generating whilst it's under inspection. And then the last example here is virtual reality. So we've also partnered with Deakin's engineering school to allow people to experience wind farms before they're built, hear the sounds, interact with them, which is very good for schools, community meetings, events, and even more so in this post-COVID world where we may have travel restrictions. It's great to be able to show people the impacts without having to take them to an operational wind farm site. I think I've just about run out of time, so I did say it would be a quick walkthrough of how to develop a wind farm, but are there any questions?
Yes. Thanks for a brilliant speech, Emma, and some questions from my side. That is okay. So the first question is how long will a wind project take from environmental impact assessment to commissioning?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the examples I gave on the slide previously are probably the best examples I can give of that. Every project will differ, but the best takeaways I can say from that is, you know, you can expect maybe 2 years for your environmental impact statement and planning. Again, it depends what state you're in. Maybe you need another year after that for preparing for your financial close, securing a PPA, and then construction usually takes 18 months to 2 years. So the best part of 5 years is probably the most average answer I can give you. But as I said, it depends on the project, the state, and many risks. So some wind farms have been considerably more than that.
Okay, then let's go to the next question is what's the main impacts of COVID-19 on the development of wind farms in Australia for ACCIONA?
Sure. So I'll touch on a few more that I didn't cover in the presentation. So as I mentioned, we've made sure we're avoiding mass gatherings. We're having to keep an eye on policies and guidelines as they're changing day by day, literally day by day at the moment in Victoria. We're noticing some skills we're not able to procure locally. So keeping an eye on border restrictions is another key one. And the other impact is manufacturing. So for example, on our 220 kV underground transmission line that I mentioned earlier for Mortlake, you know, there's one particular joint that is coming from Singapore, and that's been held up, and therefore it affects the entire chain of the transmission line. The same for our towers. You know, if you have one component that's coming from a factory in Korea and that's been shut down, that affects the entire delivery schedule for the towers. So those are the main impacts we've seen from a construction perspective. From an operations perspective, I think we've been quite fortunate and able to keep operating the plants. But overall, yeah, we're just seeing the travel restrictions are affecting us the most.
Thank you, Emma. And then now we go to the third question, that there is a slowdown in wind development due to grid constraints in the EM. How to stop it or minimize its following losses as a developer?
Well, if I could solve it, I would be very fortunate and need a crystal ball. But the best thing I can do is give advice on how to minimize it, or the key steps you can do to mitigate against that. As the other presentations have covered, it's a huge risk at the moment, and one that I don't think will go away quickly. But the key things we've learned to mitigate are to plan ahead, I guess is the first of maybe 4 things. Plan ahead and invest in skilled and locally experienced resources in grid connection studies, establish good working relationships with AEMO and the network provider in the state you're operating in. The second would be early engagement with the network service providers. So the renewable energy zone concepts that were mentioned earlier in the presentations, they provide opportunities for developers to work together to achieve overall outcomes. So they're quite a good example of how we can maybe change the system and work with the network service providers better to develop future assets. And the last 2, keep abreast of rule changes, future upgrades. That's a no-brainer really, but close engagement with the AEMC, contributing to forums, consultations, and trying to influence the outcome where possible of future changes. And from a development perspective, last but not least, work towards a diverse portfolio, and that may mean geographic around the NEM, but that may also be different voltage levels. You know, try and mitigate future curtailments and system strength issues by having a diverse portfolio.
Thank you, Emma. And the last question is, do you think wind farm construction technology development in Europe will benefit the growing industry in Australia?
Yeah, we have seen some benefits from Europe. Tower cranes are now here in Australia, and there are some things that would be beneficial. Most, obviously, as you will be aware, most wind turbine technology evolves from either Europe or China. But effectively, construction is the same worldwide, and there are a lot of solutions that are present locally. So Europe may be ahead for wind turbine innovation, but Australia is actually, you know, a leader in mining, and we can take best practices from construction and share those with the rest of the world, actually. So, you know, construction is construction wherever you go around the world. So yes, the technology may be imported here, but I think there are still some things that we could lead on. It's also possible that the highest and the taller wind turbines may be rolled out here first. So, you know, I mentioned our McIntyre wind farm earlier. It's likely that the Nordex 5.7 megawatt machine that we're intending to use for that wind farm, it could be installed first worldwide in Australia, depending on the schedules for the projects. So it could be that actually some of the biggest turbines are installed in Australia first, as opposed to other countries. And the more OEMs and more wind turbine manufacturers that we see set up in Australia, the better. But yeah, I think there's probably a mutual benefit in place between Europe and Australia for that.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for your presentation and answering. And in order to be on time, there will be no time left for the Q&A box. But attendees can raise questions still in the Q&A box, and speakers can answer it online. And many thanks, thousands of thanks for our respectful speakers' presentations. And I hope all of you can learn a lot from today's webinar. And additionally, I'm delighted to announce the official launch of Australia Wind Energy 2021 in Melbourne on 23rd to 24th batch. Australia Wind Energy is a premier information exchange and business networking platform between multiple stakeholders in this country's wind value chain. The two-day show is estimated to attract more than 500 industry stakeholders representing Australia federal and state governments, domestic and international developers, utilities, financials, EPCs, as well as key equipment and solution providers. And at last, don't worry too much, the presentation slides as well as the recordings will be shared by email link within 1 week. Thanks a lot again for your participation. See you next time.